The house had already burned down when the cloth was ordered. That is the detail that stopped me cold, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I was not even looking for anything unusual. I was going through a box of old estate paperwork that a colleague had passed along to me, the kind of dry administrative work that most researchers consider a chore. Ledgers, inventories, correspondence, receipts. The smell of old paper is something you either love or you learn to ignore, and I had learned to love it years ago. There is something honest about a document that has survived longer than the person who wrote it. The inventory I was reading was detailed in the way that only truly organized households ever managed, every room cataloged, every piece of furniture listed with its condition and approximate value, linens counted, candlesticks counted, kitchen tools counted one by one, the kind of document that tells you more about how people actually lived than any history book ever could. And then, in the margin of the third page, written in a different hand than the rest, a small addition, a note about a recurring purchase. Heavy cloth, dark weave, sufficient thickness to block light in both directions, ordered 4 times a year, listed as essential maintenance. No explanation given for what it covered or why. I almost moved past it. I almost did. But something made me stop and look at the heading of the page again, and that is when I noticed the date of the inventory. It had been completed several months after a fire had destroyed most of the house. The family had already lost several members. There was no period of mourning being observed at the time the cloth was ordered. The household was in the middle of being wound down, not maintained. So, who ordered the cloth, and what were they covering? I set the page down on my desk and sat with that question for a moment. The room was quiet. Late afternoon light was coming in at a low angle through the window behind me, and it caught the surface of the small mirror on the wall across from my desk in a way that made the reflection look slightly deeper than usual, slightly further back than the glass should allow. I noticed it, and then I looked away, which is a strange thing to do when nothing has happened, but I did it anyway. I went back to the box. I was not obsessing. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next sounds like the beginning of an obsession, but at the time it felt like nothing more than professional curiosity. I was simply doing what any careful researcher does, which is follow a thread when it appears, not because you expect it to lead anywhere dramatic, but because you have learned that threads which seem to go nowhere are sometimes the ones that matter most. I pulled out the rest of the papers and sorted them by type. Among them was a second inventory, unrelated to the first, from a completely different household in a different region. Different family, different decade, different economic circumstances entirely. A modest merchant's home rather than a large estate. And there, in the maintenance column of the household log, the same entry. Heavy cloth, regular replacement, described without elaboration as necessary. 2 households, no connection between them, same entry. I put both documents side by side on my desk and looked at them for a long time. Outside, a car passed slowly in the street below. Someone was cooking something nearby, and the smell of it came faintly through the window. Everything was completely ordinary, and I could not stop looking at those 2 lines of handwriting from 2 different people who had never met each other, describing the same unexplained purchase in almost the same words. If this is the kind of story that makes the back of your neck feel a little cooler than it did a minute ago, then you are exactly the kind of person I made this for. Subscribe and leave a like if you want to know where this goes, because I promise you, it goes somewhere you are not expecting. I need to tell you what I found next, because this is where it stops feeling like a coincidence. Over the following days, I went through every set of household records I could get my hands on. Not looking for anything specific yet, just reading, the way you read when you are not sure what you are looking for, but you will know it when you see it. And I kept seeing it. A retired schoolteacher's estate from one region, a boarding house register from another, a landlord's property maintenance log covering several decades, a physician's household accounts, which you would think would be among the most rational and unsentimental documents imaginable. In every one of them, the same item appeared at regular intervals: heavy cloth, good weave, for the glass. Sometimes the phrasing varied slightly. Sometimes it was listed as covering cloth or dark cloth or simply maintenance cloth, but the pattern was identical. Regular purchase, treated as routine, never once explained. What bothered me was not just the consistency, it was the tone. None of these entries had the feel of a custom being followed out of habit or tradition. They read the way an entry about replacing a worn lock reads, or an entry about repointing brickwork. They read like something that was done because not doing it would be a genuine problem. A gap in the protection of the house. Something left unaddressed that needed to be addressed. And here is the detail that I keep coming back to. The one that made me understand this was not simply a matter of old-fashioned housekeeping. In 3 of the records I found, the cloth had been replaced ahead of schedule. Not because it was worn out in the ordinary sense, because it had become, in the words of one entry, too thin in the weave to be reliable. The person writing that entry was not describing a cloth that had physically deteriorated from use. They were describing a cloth that had become insufficient for its purpose, as if the purpose required a specific density, as if something needed to be kept from passing through it. And the person writing that entry clearly understood this without needing to explain it further, the way you understand without explanation that a cracked window needs replacing before winter. The knowledge was simply there, assumed, shared, obvious, except that nobody alive today shares it. Nobody today would know what that entry meant without stopping to think about it the way I was stopping to think about it, in a quiet room, with 2 documents side by side on a desk and a mirror on the wall that I had already looked away from once for no reason I could name. The manuals were not what I expected, and what I expected was nothing unusual at all. I want to be honest about that. When I started tracking down the old domestic management guides, the kind that told households how to function properly in earlier centuries, I was looking for context. I thought I would find the cloth entries explained away as some minor regional custom, something tied to a specific climate or a specific type of furniture polish. I thought I would find a boring answer and close the folder and move on. That is genuinely what I expected. The first manual I located was held in a university archive about 2 hours from where I live. I drove out on a gray Tuesday morning, signed in, put on the cotton gloves they hand you at the desk, and sat down with the book in a reading room that smelled of old binding glue and radiator dust. The book was heavier than it looked. The pages were dense with small print and occasional diagrams showing the correct arrangement of household furniture. Recipes, cleaning schedules, instructions for preserving food through winter. Exactly what you would expect. And then, roughly halfway through, a chapter on the management of sleeping rooms. I almost skimmed it. I am glad I did not. The chapter began normally enough with recommendations about ventilation and the proper weight of bedding for different seasons. But partway down the second page, the tone shifted, not dramatically. Not into anything you could point to and say, here is where it gets strange. It shifted the way a conversation shifts when someone stops making small talk and starts telling you something they actually mean. The writing became more precise, more specific, and it began discussing reflective surfaces. The instruction was not framed as tradition or custom. It was framed as maintenance, the same way the entry about inspecting roof tiles was framed as maintenance, or the entry about checking that cellar doors sealed properly. The author wrote that reflective surfaces in sleeping rooms required regular attention, that the covering cloths must be of sufficient weave to prevent the movement of light in either direction, and that they must be inspected on a fixed schedule and replaced whenever the material had thinned beyond a certain point. That phrase again. Thinned beyond a certain point. I sat with that for a moment in the quiet reading room. Someone coughed softly at the table behind me. A radiator ticked. And I read the next line, which explained the reason for all of this in language so flat and matter-of-fact that it took me a second to understand what I had just read. The manual said, without any ceremony or apology, that the covering was necessary to prevent accumulation in the glass, not reflection, accumulation, as if the mirror were a surface that collected something the way a shelf collects dust, except that whatever it collected was considered dangerous enough to warrant a maintenance schedule and a minimum cloth density. I turned the page. The chapter continued with equal calmness into advice about the placement of water basins and the direction that beds should face. The mirror instructions sat among those ordinary things like a stone in a handful of grain, unremarkable to whoever had written it, completely unremarkable. Which was, I realized sitting there with my gloved hands on the page, the most unsettling thing about it. I found 2 more manuals over the following week. Both from different countries, both from different periods. Both contained the same instruction in different words. One of them added a detail the first had not included, that accumulation was considered to increase significantly in the hours after midnight, and that a mirror left uncovered through those hours in a room where someone slept was a specific and serious problem. Not a vague problem, a specific one. The kind of problem you prevent with the right materials and the right schedule. I photographed every relevant page and drove home in the dark, thinking about the word accumulation and what exactly a person in a previous century thought was accumulating inside a piece of glass while their household slept. Here is what I did not know yet, what I would only understand later when I found out what the old mirrors were actually made of. The mirrors being discussed in those manuals were not the kind you and I own. They were not manufactured objects produced in a factory to a standard specification. They were made individually, by hand, using a process that involved toxic metals applied to thick hand-blown glass that was rarely perfectly flat and rarely perfectly clear. The glass itself had a slight color to it, green or blue depending on its origin, and the reflective layer behind it had a depth and a texture that modern mirrors simply do not have. When you looked into one of these mirrors, you were not looking at a flat silvered surface. You were looking into something. The reflection sat back from the glass in a way that felt almost spatial, almost like looking through a window into a room that was not quite the same as the room you were standing in. Contemporary accounts describe this quality consistently, not as a flaw, as a characteristic, as something these mirrors had that was understood to be part of what they were. Several accounts use the same word for it, and the word was depth, not visual depth in the technical sense. Something more than that, something that the writers seem to reach for and never quite find the right language for. The way you reach for language when you are trying to describe something that everyone around you has also experienced but that nobody has ever needed to name before. And the craftsmen who made these mirrors, the people who spent their working lives in the workshops where the process happened, did not live long. The materials were harmful, and the exposure was constant, and many of them developed serious conditions before middle age, tremors, confusion, a particular kind of deterioration that their contemporaries noted and recorded with sympathy, but without surprise. It was understood to be the cost of the work. What nobody recorded, or at least what nobody recorded in a document that survived, was whether the craftsmen thought the mirrors they were making were simply beautiful objects, or whether they knew something about what they were producing that the people who eventually hung those mirrors in their homes also knew and covered every night before going to sleep. 3 separate accounts describe the same face in 3 different countries, in 3 different centuries, and none of those people had ever met. I want to be careful here about how I present what I found because I am aware of how it sounds. I am a researcher. I work with documents. I deal in what can be verified and what can be sourced and what can be cross-referenced. So, when I tell you that the surviving accounts of what people actually experienced when they left those mirrors uncovered are consistent in ways that should not be possible given how far apart those accounts were produced, I am telling you that as someone who spent a long time looking for an alternative explanation before accepting what the documents actually said. The accounts I am talking about were not gathered in one place. They were scattered across different archives, different collections, different languages. Some were in letters, some were in parish records, some were tucked into the margins of household logs, written in a smaller hand than the surrounding entries, as if the writer had added them later, privately, in a quieter moment. And across all of them, regardless of origin, regardless of period, regardless of the circumstances of the person writing, the experiences described fell into three distinct categories so consistently that I eventually stopped being surprised by the pattern and started simply documenting it. The first and most common was the simplest to describe and the hardest to dismiss. People reported the sensation of being watched from within the glass, not from behind them, not from somewhere else in the room, from inside the mirror itself. They described it not as a feeling of general unease, but as something directional and specific, the way you can feel someone's attention on you from across a room even before you turn to look. Except when they turned to look, the room behind them was empty, and the feeling was coming from in front of them, from the glass, from whatever was sitting in that depth behind the surface that the craftsmen had spent their lives producing and their own lives paying for. The second category was worse. People described watching their own reflection and noticing, after a period of stillness, that the reflection was not keeping pace. A slight delay, a fraction of a moment behind, as if the image in the glass was receiving instructions from somewhere, and those instructions were arriving just a little late. Several accounts described holding completely still to test it, standing without moving and watching the reflection for any sign of independent motion. And in almost every account where someone did this, the reflection eventually moved on its own. A small movement. The kind of thing you could almost explain away, except that the people writing these accounts were not trying to explain it away. They were writing it down carefully, precisely, with the composed handwriting of someone recording a fact they have already accepted and are simply trying to preserve accurately for whoever comes next. The third category appeared least often in the records, and the accounts that described it were written in a different tone than the others. Quieter, more careful, as if the person writing had thought for a long time about whether to write it at all. These accounts described something appearing in the mirror that had no origin in the room, a shape at an angle that no one present could have produced, a form moving across the surface as if passing through a space that existed behind the glass rather than in front of it. The room reflected correctly in every other detail. Only this one element was wrong. Only this one thing was there that should not have been. And here is the part that stayed with me longest. In none of these accounts did the writer express surprise, shock sometimes, and fear, but not surprise. The way you are not surprised when something you have been warned about finally happens. The way you are not surprised when a door you knew was not properly locked turns out to have been opened in the night. The covering cloth existed because these things were known, not suspected. Known. What I found next, I was not prepared for, and I say that as someone who thought by that point that I had read enough to be prepared for most things. Among the documents I had collected, several described not just the experience of seeing something in an uncovered mirror, but the procedure required afterward, and I use the word procedure deliberately, because that is exactly what these descriptions were, step by step, ordered, specific. The kind of language you use when the stakes of getting it wrong are high enough that you cannot afford to leave anything to interpretation. The procedure began with removal in full daylight, never at night, never by a single person working alone. The mirror was not to be looked at directly during removal. It was to be wrapped immediately and completely in cloth that had not been used for any other purpose, new cloth, and the wrapping was to leave no gap, no edge of glass exposed to open air. The wrapped mirror was then to be moved away from the house, away from any other reflective surface, and broken, not cracked, not scratched. Broken into pieces small enough that no fragment retained a recognizable shape, nothing large enough to still function as a mirror in any meaningful sense. The pieces were buried separately, not together, in locations spaced well apart from each other and from the original house. And the cloth used for the wrapping was burned, not discarded, burned completely. I read that procedure in the first document that described it and thought it was an isolated case, something specific to that household or that region. Then I found the same procedure in a second document, then a third. Different countries, different periods, different languages, same steps in the same order with the same reasoning given each time. The reasoning was always some version of the same idea, that a mirror which had been left uncovered long enough under the wrong conditions had become something other than a mirror, that whatever had accumulated in the glass over those uncovered hours had reached a point where it could not be safely dispersed, that the mirror at that stage was not a reflective surface anymore. It was something that needed to be contained and then taken apart carefully, and then its pieces separated so that what was inside them could not reassemble. This was not a ritual in the religious sense. There was no prayer described, no ceremony, no symbolic gesture. It was purely practical, the way dealing with a structural problem in a building is practical. You do the steps because the steps work, and you do them in the right order because the order matters, and you do not skip any of them because skipping them has consequences. The word that one of the documents used for a mirror in this condition was occupied. And reading that word in context, in the flat, careful handwriting of someone who clearly knew exactly what they meant by it, I felt something shift in the way I was thinking about all of this. Because occupied is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic description of a feeling or an impression. It is a precise word chosen to describe a specific condition. A mirror that was occupied was a mirror that contained something that had come in through the glass during the uncovered hours and had not left when morning came. And the procedure for dealing with it existed because people had learned, through experience, what happened when you did not follow it. The practice did not fade. It was cut. And I can tell you almost exactly when and almost exactly how, and the precision of it is what makes it impossible to treat as coincidence. I had been sitting with the procedure documents for several days, turning the word occupied over in my mind the way you turn a stone over to see what is underneath, when I noticed something in the dating of the sources I had collected. I had not been paying close attention to chronology up to that point because the pattern across the documents had seemed consistent enough that the dates felt secondary. But when I finally laid everything out in order and looked at the timeline, I stopped moving for a moment and just looked at what I was seeing. The records of the covering practice, the maintenance entries, the manual chapters, the letters passing the knowledge from one generation to the next ran continuously and consistently up to a certain point. And then they stopped. Not gradually, not with a slow thinning of references over decades the way you see when a custom loses relevance and quietly fades. They stopped the way a signal stops when someone cuts the wire. Present, 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 and then gone. Within a window of roughly a single decade, the entries disappeared from household records across regions that had maintained them without interruption for generations. The manuals that had devoted careful chapters to the subject went out of print. New editions appeared without those chapters. No explanation given, no note that the section had been removed, simply absent, as if it had never been there. I pulled the publishing records for 3 of the manuals I had located. In each case, the pattern was the same. The edition that contained the mirror instructions was the last edition printed in the old format. The next edition, printed within a few years, was described in its preface as revised and modernized. The mirror chapter did not appear in the revised version. Neither did any reference to the fact that a mirror chapter had previously existed. Someone had made a decision. Not one person in one place, but the same decision made across multiple publishers in multiple regions in the same narrow window of time. And decisions that look like that synchronized, do not happen by accident. They happen because something changed that made the old information either unnecessary or inconvenient, and someone with enough reach decided that the new additions should reflect that change. What changed was the mirrors themselves. I already knew this was coming because the physical difference between the old mirrors and the new ones had been sitting in the back of my mind since I had read those contemporary descriptions of depth and accumulation. But it was only when I matched the timeline of the manual revisions against the historical record of mirror production that the shape of it became fully clear. The shift from the old handmade mercury amalgam process to the new industrial silvering method happened in almost exactly the same window as the disappearance of the covering practice, not before. Not after. Simultaneously, the old mirrors were replaced, and the instructions for managing them vanished at the same time, as part of the same quiet transformation. And within a single generation, almost no one alive remembered that the two things had ever been connected. I kept thinking about a particular kind of mechanism as I worked through this. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a group of people in a room deciding to deceive the public, but something more like the way a building gets quietly decommissioned. You stop maintaining the systems you no longer need, you remove the infrastructure, you repurpose the space. And eventually, the building looks completely normal from the outside, and nobody walking through it has any idea that the walls were once doing something entirely different. The old mirrors were the infrastructure, and something had decided it was time to replace them. I want to tell you what I found when I started looking at the broader context of that same period, because this is where the story stops being about mirrors specifically and starts being about something much larger, and I was not ready for that when it happened. The same decade that saw the covering practice disappear and the old mirrors replaced was also a decade of extraordinary physical change to the built environment in cities across the Western world. Buildings that had stood for generations were being torn down and replaced at a pace that, when you look at the records now, seems almost frantic. Not the gradual change of a growing city finding space for new construction. Something more deliberate, more selective. The buildings being removed were of a particular kind, large, ornate, with a specific architectural vocabulary that does not map cleanly onto any of the historical styles we learned the names of in school. High ceilings, elaborate stonework, structural geometries that served no obvious practical purpose, and inside many of them, mirrors. Not incidental mirrors, not decorative mirrors placed where they looked attractive. Mirrors placed in configurations that, when you study the floor plans of the buildings that survived long enough to be documented, appear to follow a consistent internal logic. The mirrors in those buildings were positioned in relation to light sources with a precision that does not make sense if the purpose was purely visual. The angles were too specific. The relationships between the mirror positions and the structural geometry of the rooms were too deliberate. In several documented cases, the mirrors had been installed as part of the original construction, built into the walls rather than hung on them, which means whoever designed the building had planned for them from the beginning. They were not decoration added later. They were part of the design in the same way that load-bearing walls are part of the design. I spent 2 weeks going through architectural records from that period, and the more I read, the more uncomfortable I became, not with what the records said, but with what they didn't say. The buildings were demolished. The reasons given in the official records were always practical. Structural concerns, urban development, the needs of a modernizing city. But the buildings being replaced were not in poor condition in most cases. They were functional. They were used. And the rate of demolition in that narrow window was too high and too consistent across too many locations to be explained by normal patterns of urban renewal. Something was being taken apart. And the mirrors were part of what was being taken apart. And the household mirrors, the ones that ordinary families had been covering every night for generations, were replaced in the same window as if someone understood that the two things were connected. as if replacing the household mirrors was the last step in a process that had begun with the demolition of the larger buildings. As if the whole system, whatever it had been doing, was being systematically shut down, room by room, building by building, city by city. And the question I could not stop returning to was whether whoever made that decision had shut it down because it was dangerous, or because it was useful to someone else. The old mirror did not reflect the room correctly, and the man who owned it knew it, and he had owned it for 11 years without telling anyone. I found him through a private collector network, the kind of quiet community that exists around antique objects of unusual provenance. I had been asking about surviving examples of pre-industrial mercury amalgam mirrors, the kind described in the household manuals and estate records I had spent months reading. Most of what I found were fragments, pieces preserved in museums behind glass, labeled as decorative objects from a particular period with no mention of what they had once been used for or how the families who owned them had managed them. But this man, whose name I will not use here because he asked me not to, had a complete example. Unrestored, original backing, never rehung after it had been removed from the house where it had spent most of its existence. He kept it in a storage room at the back of his property, face down on a padded surface, covered with a heavy canvas that he replaced every few years. He had never looked into it after dark. He had inherited it along with a single handwritten page of instructions from the relative who had passed it to him, and those instructions were specific enough that he had followed them without question for over a decade. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the same practical respect you give to a tool you do not fully understand. He let me examine it in the middle of the day, with every light in the room on and the door open to the outside. Even under those conditions, standing in front of it felt different from standing in front of an ordinary mirror. The reflection was correct in every measurable way. My face, my hands, the room behind me, all present and accurate. But the image sat at a depth that did not match the physical thickness of the glass. It was not an optical illusion in any sense I could name or explain. It was simply that the reflection appeared to exist further back than it should, as if the glass were a window into a space that extended behind the wall. The contemporary descriptions I had read, the ones that reached for language and never quite found it, suddenly made complete sense to me in a way they had not made from the page alone. I stayed for 2 hours. I took photographs. I measured the glass. I looked at the backing and the frame and the construction of the thing from every angle I could manage. And when I drove home that evening, I sat in my car outside my house for a few minutes before going in, not because I was frightened, but because something had shifted in the way I understood the problem. Because standing in front of that mirror, even in full daylight, even with every precaution the owner had quietly and consistently maintained, I had understood for the first time in my body, rather than just in my mind, why the cloth had needed to be thick enough to block light in both directions. The old mirrors were not the same kind of object as the new ones. They were not an earlier version of the same technology. They were a different thing entirely, and the new ones had not improved on them. The new ones had replaced them with something that did not have the same properties, and the people who made that replacement had understood exactly what properties they were removing. I thought about the letter the elderly woman had written to her daughter. The new ones do not hold. I had read that phrase a dozen times in the months before and understood it intellectually. Sitting in my car that evening, I understood it the other way, the way that stays with you. The new mirrors do not hold because they were made not to hold. The flatness, the shallowness, the optical precision of the industrial product was not a side effect of the new process. It was the point of it. Someone had engineered the depth out of the glass and, in doing so, had closed something that the old mirrors had left permanently open. The question I could not shake was whether that someone had done it to protect people or to protect something else. I published nothing from this research. I want to be straightforward about that. I have a professional life that does not accommodate the kind of conclusions this material points toward, and I spent a long time deciding how much of what I found to put into any form that could be shared. What I am telling you now is the honest shape of what the documents showed me, without embellishment and without the parts I cannot verify. The parts I cannot verify are stranger than what I have told you, and I have chosen to leave them out. What I did in the end was simpler than writing a paper or filing a report. I went through my own home, room by room, methodically, the way the old household inventories had been compiled, with attention to every reflective surface, the mirrors in the bathroom, the hallway, the bedroom, a framed print with glass over it that catches the light at a certain angle in the morning, the dark window above the kitchen sink that becomes a near-perfect mirror after the sun goes down. I wrote each one down: location, approximate age, known history or lack of it. Most of them I could account for. Bought new, installed recently, flat, shallow, industrial. Safe, in the sense that the word safe applied to this situation in a way I was only now beginning to understand properly. But there was one I could not account for. A small mirror in the back hallway, oval, in a dark wooden frame that had been in the house when I moved in. I had never thought about it before. I had walked past it every day for years without registering it as anything other than part of the background of a space I had stopped seeing because I knew it too well. I stood in front of it that evening and looked at it properly for the first time. The frame was old. The glass had a very slight greenish tone that I had never noticed before, and the reflection, when I leaned in to look, sat at a depth that did not match the thickness of the glass. I do not know where that mirror came from. I do not know how long it had been in that hallway before I moved in. I do not know how many nights it had been uncovered in the years before I lived there, or what the conditions had been in the house during those nights, or what the word occupied would mean applied to an object that size in a space that narrow. What I know is that I covered it that night. I found a piece of heavy fabric and I folded it until the layers were dense enough to block light in both directions, and I fixed it over the glass with enough overlap that no edge was exposed, and I have covered it every night since. Not because I am certain of anything, but because the people who came before me, the ones who wrote those maintenance entries in their careful handwriting and replaced the cloths on schedule and passed the knowledge from one generation to the next, were not afraid of nothing. They were managing something specific, with tools they understood, according to a logic that worked well enough to sustain an unbroken practice across hundreds of years and dozens of countries and every level of society from farmhouse to manor. We lost that logic in a single decade. We did not grow out of it. It was taken out of the manuals, and the mirrors were swapped out, and within a generation, the whole system of knowledge had dissolved as if it had never existed. And now, we live in houses full of reflective surfaces whose histories we have never checked, and we sleep in rooms where the glass sits uncovered all night in whatever light happens to reach it, and we have no idea what the people before us knew, or why they were so careful, or what they were careful about. Here is what I think this whole story comes down to. Knowledge that is maintained for hundreds of years across completely unconnected people is not superstition. It is experience, accumulated and passed forward by people who had good reasons for every specific detail they preserved. When that kind of knowledge disappears in a single decade, the question is never whether people stopped believing it. The question is who decided they should stop, and what was convenient about that timing, and what we have been living with ever since inside homes we think we know completely. So I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. There is a mirror somewhere in your home right now whose history you do not know. You do not know where it came from before it came to you. You do not know what happened in the rooms it hung in before yours, or how many nights it spent uncovered in conditions that the people who originally owned it would have recognized as the wrong kind. And tonight, like every other night, you will go to sleep, and it will stay uncovered in the dark, and whatever the light does to it in the small hours, you will not be awake to see. Does that feel fine to you? Or does something in the back of your mind, something older than your own reasoning, feel just slightly less certain than it did before you started listening to this? Write what you think in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if this story made you look at something in your home differently tonight, share it with someone who you think needs to hear it, and subscribe if you want to keep going deeper, because there is more to this, and the next part is harder to explain than anything I have told you so far.